because as load shedding continues unabated, pressure is mounting on President Cyril Ramaphosa to provide a solution. Households and businesses are in distress over the crippling power cuts. The President has met with Eskom executives and other stakeholders to map a way forward, and of course the Democratic Alliance this afternoon making it known that they're also joining a long or growing list of interested parties who are taking government to court on this matter of Eskom. Senior researcher at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, Dr. Muller, joins us now to weigh in on this situation. Dr. Muller, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with the intention by various interested parties to take government to compel it to solve the crisis at Eskom. Your thought, is it a step in the right direction at least?
No, not really. I think it's just a case of political performance. I think that's understandable. It's inevitable that political parties and other kinds of entities will try and make some capital out of this. But I don't see any way in which taking government to court is going to help solve the problem.
What is then, because the President also cancelled his trip to Davos, albeit not for the first time, to have another meeting with Eskom executives and various stakeholders. And here we are, we're hearing murmurs that Eskom is saying, well, this is still going to be with us for another 2 years at least.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that's also a small case of political performance. I think it would have been bad for the President to be seen to be overseas at a kind of elite gathering like Davos when South Africans are going through stage 6 load shedding on a day-to-day basis. Having said that, I think given that Eskom was planning to make an announcement regarding the sort of short-term likelihood of load shedding and their approach to that, I think it may have been necessary for the President to meet with them to find out exactly what they were proposing and whether there might be some alternatives on the table. And certainly he's well within his rights to do that. I think the bigger question as to what the solution is, that's obviously very hard, given that President Ramaphosa did come in 4 years ago, back in 2018. The situation, I think, then was already very serious. Now that we've gotten to stage 6, it's far worse. So essentially, there's not much sign of progress over the last 4 years, and therefore finding solutions is even harder. What I would like to say is, the one area where Andre de Ruyter and Eskom have made some progress notionally over the last 4 years is in breaking up Eskom. And my view is that that's essentially where some of these problems come from, is that the President was sold the idea that breaking up Eskom, privatizing it, pushing decentralized energy generation and renewable energy was going to help solve the Eskom problem. And a number of us said at the time that was very unlikely. When you have an entity that's in crisis, breaking it up may not be the best thing to do. You're devoting your energies to separating out this entity. And that separation potentially could have some benefits in 5 to 10 years' time when we're looking at maybe competitors on the grid and so forth. But in terms of addressing a short-term crisis, it was a mistake. And what's worrying is that a number of the voices that are dominating the public space, including experts, one of whom, in fact, you just, I think, had on your show recently, people who are responsible for giving President Ramaphosa bad advice, the same people who are now being quoted. And essentially, they're doubling down on these things. I think it was Mark Swilling who said we should ride the renewable energy revolution. It's just nonsense. One of the reasons we're seeing some of these issues with Eskom tariffs, Eskom's finances are being worsened by the decentralized energy generation, even as that decentralized generation may be helping to some degree with load shedding. And people like Mark Swilling and others are not saying anything about that. So we have individuals who, in my view, are responsible for giving the President and his advisors and other individuals in government bad advice. Those same individuals are now being relied on to give advice on how to solve the problems that I think they've partly contributed to over the last 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. I could read between the lines. However, I'd like maybe a clear indication of this. What then is the motive for that bad advice? We are a people traumatized by whatever form of corruption is decorated in whatever word, whether it was the leg deal or the arms deal or state capture or 4, 2, 3, 5, 9 wasted years. And now we are sitting with this mess. And so you ask yourself, who then benefits? Because it sure is not you and I.
Right. So it's interesting you mentioned the arms deal. I've been thinking about this over a number of years, and I have to say that what I'm seeing in terms of the distortion of South Africa's energy transition, I think that it's not going to be the same kind of looting as the arms deal, but I think the scale of the social surplus that's going to be taken away from ordinary South Africans could rival what happened with the arms deal in terms of the distortion of the energy transition in South Africa. And what's very clear is that there are foreign interests, foreign governments, multinationals, and also private interests, renewable energy companies, large corporations that can afford to invest in decentralized energy generation that small businesses, ordinary South Africans cannot afford to do. Those large corporations, for example, want to opt out of paying high Eskom tariffs, and they want the costs of that to be shifted onto ordinary South Africans through higher tariffs, and also shifted onto the national balance sheet, moving Eskom's debt. So there are many players involved. When it comes to the bad advice, I think that there are different reasons. Sometimes you have experts who genuinely believe that what they're proposing will work, even though I think there are often good reasons to believe that they're wrong. In other cases, there are experts who are taking money from these kinds of interests that I was referring to, international organizations which notionally are supposed to enable the sort of green revolution, energy transition, but are being funded by foreign governments that are exploiting their own fossil fuels, for example. So those NGOs are funded by foreign governments that are exploiting their own fossil fuels, and those NGOs lobby to stop South Africa from exploiting our gas resources, which would partly help to stop load shedding, or and to stop things like gas-independent power projects, right? So there are all these different interests, and this is one of the problems: is that when you come to an issue like Eskom, it's so large and it's so important. You can't actually get away from the broader problems of the country. Ideally, we'd like to park these kinds of issues, the lobbying, the vested interests kind of thing, and focus on like technical issues as how we're going to solve this. But you can't when the individuals who are advising the president, or the individuals who are being relied on to make these decisions, or the individuals who are being quoted in the press all the time, and therefore misleading the public as to the nature of the problem and how it's going to be solved. You can't get away from dealing with those issues when you've got a problem as big as Eskom.
And then in enters this, I do wonder what your understanding of it is. We've seen a number of videos doing the rounds of coal trucks literally queuing to enter Richards Bay so that they can leave the country. You spoke of NGOs who are lobbying for South Africa to get off of this and get off of that. We do know also at COP27, right, a lot of commitments were made, including that South Africa will move away from coal. Yet here we see coal being transported out of the country to other continents that are facing energy crisis. How do we understand that in the context of everything also that is going on?
Well, I think the important thing on that kind of issue to understand, and we saw it also with COVID vaccines to some extent, with countries that were producing COVID vaccines and sending them overseas even though they didn't have enough for their own citizens. That's essentially the way that the free market economy works. And that's not necessarily inevitable, but if one is in a country that's adopted a free market economy, then you're going to end up exporting coal, even if perhaps you have a shortage of coal locally. Although I don't know if we do in fact have a shortage of coal. I don't think shortages of coal are a major source of problems at Eskom. But I think there's too much simplification of these kinds of issues. Let's take, you just had Herman Mashaba on your show, right? And he was saying that there's no way we're going to solve the Eskom problem unless we get rid of the ANC. Well, as an opposition politician, you'd expect him to say that. What I'm suggesting is that the problems at Eskom are much more fundamental. I don't think, that the corruption at Eskom power plants and so forth is not going to stop just because you get a new political party in place. I think President Ramaphosa does, in some sense, have the political will to solve the problem, but he doesn't necessarily have the channels and the advice to do so. But if you look at, for example, what Herman Mashaba said, he said we should bring back the Scorpions. Well, it was the ANC government that created the Scorpions, right? So there are these kinds of nuances. I think that the crucial thing, and I don't have a solution, and I'm not sure that anybody in Eskom has a solution. But the crucial thing is to treat it as a crisis. I mean, people have been saying this for a while. But if the priority is to stop load shedding, right, or at least reduce the stage of load shedding, then what are the steps that need to be taken? For example, it's been reported that the Treasury is withholding money from Eskom for its diesel that it uses to essentially try and reduce the level of load shedding by using essentially emergency power facilities. Now, why is the Treasury doing that? I mean, of course, the Treasury has an obligation to watch the public's finances, but the Treasury at the same time has been producing estimates saying that the cost of load shedding to the economy is enormous. So now maybe there's some sensible explanation for this behind the scenes, but on the face of it, doesn't make sense. We're being told by the President that this is a crisis. He recognizes it's a crisis. He's staying at home instead of going to Davos. But we're hearing from other reports that the Minister of Finance and the Treasury are withholding money from Eskom that it needs for diesel to reduce the severity of load shedding. So what's going on there? All the relevant steps need to be taken. I think efforts are being made to combat corruption. I'm still not convinced of the degree to which day-to-day corruption is a problem, is a cause of these things. Under Andre de Ruyter's leadership, we heard a lot about sabotage and so on. I'm unaware of any prosecutions that have taken place, and I'm unaware of evidence of the degree to which that's actually contributed to load shedding. I think for myself, I think it's a good thing that Mr. de Ruyter is on his way out. I don't think he's succeeded. I think he's prioritized other issues like breaking up Eskom and pursuing an overly hasty energy transition. But of course, the question is who's going to come in to replace him. There is a better board in place, which again was something that your previous speaker was referring to. So measures are in place. But definitely what the country needs to hear is what is the solution and what can ordinary South Africans expect over the next, as you said, 2 to 3 years? What stage of load shedding can be expected? And it should be predictable in some sense. We shouldn't have reached stage 6. Certainly nobody said to South Africans 2 years ago that there was a likelihood of reaching day-to-day stage 6 load shedding. And that in itself is a failure because these are technical issues and it should have been possible to foresee this.
Dr. Sean Muller is a senior researcher at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. More news for you when we return.